Talking of schools, can I get your view on what's happened to one of your colleagues being banned from speaking at a local school by a pro-Palestinian group of teachers? This is Damien Egan, also happens to be Jewish. Is that a problem?
I'm really concerned to hear about what's happened to Damien. As a constituency MP, the idea that I wouldn't be able to go and speak in a school is of deep concern, and I have asked officials in the department to urgently look at what has gone on here. We need to make sure that the school, the police can ensure that Damien can get to do that visit as soon as he can, and I hope that happens very soon.
I note that the local branch of the National Education Union celebrated this cancellation as a win for safeguarding solidarity and for the power of the NEU trade union staff group. The head of the NEU, Daniel Kabedi, called to globalise the Intifada. Are these the kind of people who should be running this union?
Damien should have been able to be in that school. And I am extremely clear that that is, a really important thing that we must protect in our democracy, the right for a local MP to be able to go into a school and talk about their job. And obviously schools are impartial places. Teachers must be impartial, and that's a really important
Should heads of unions of teachers be impartial? Calling to globalise the Intifada, Minister?
As I say, schools are meant to be impartial places. That's a really important principle for this government, and I want to make sure that Damien has the opportunity to...
If the head of the NEU had said that in the last few months, well, in Manchester or London, he'd have been arrested.
As I say, schools must be impartial.
Will you condemn that? Will you say that is obviously wrong? For the head of a teachers' union to call it to globalise the Intifada, when their union are celebrating the cancelling of one of your colleagues from a school because of pro-Palestinian, that is an obviously wrong thing to do.
I think it would be absolutely wrong to celebrate the exclusion of a member of Parliament from going to a local school. It's absolutely wrong to call for anything that suggests any sign of support for terrorist activity, of course. But we're talking here about the importance of impartiality in schools.
So on the phrase globalise the Intifada...
It's not a phrase I'd use. I don't like the phrase. It's not a good phrase. Schools must be impartial places.
Very finally, we're talking about reports this afternoon of a potential U-turn, or at least a watering down on some of the aspects of removing jury trials. I don't expect to get into the details of that. It's not on your brief, of course, but I wonder where in the manifesto Labour said that they would scrap jury trials.
I think one of the things that has been most shocking for me as an MP coming in is just seeing the state that the Conservatives left our courts in. You've got victims of serious crimes waiting 3 or 4 years to get verdicts, and I think it's right and proportionate that we look at all measures available to ensure that victims are getting justice, and I think this is a proportionate approach to that. Even
though the backlog in court cases was a well-known public before the election?
The scale of the problem is extremely severe. That has been a real shock to me, and it's right that, having looked at this in detail, having commissioned reviews to look at it, that we take proportionate action to ensure that we can get people the justice that they deserve.
Do you want your child taught by an adult who advocates that the local MP shouldn't be able to come to that school because they have a legitimate but different view to that teacher? Is that the kind of inculcation of freedom of thought, freedom of expression, free debate that you want your child taught? A planned visit by a Jewish Labour MP to a school in his Bristol constituency was cancelled after a campaign by a pro-Palestinian group of teachers. Damien Egan, the Labour MP for Bristol North East, had been booked to speak to students at the Bristol Brunel Academy, but the visit was called off by the school hours before it was due to happen. After the visit was called off, Bristol-Palestine Solidarity campaign wrote that the planned school visit by Damien Egan has been cancelled after concerns were raised by the National Education Union staff group, parents and local constituents. This is a clear message. Politicians who openly support Israel's, and I'm quoting here, genocidal assault on Gaza are not welcome in our schools. He is vice chair of Labour Friends of Israel and has visited Israel since the current onslaught in Gaza began, demonstrating his support. On their Facebook page, Bristol NEU, the local arm of the union, said, "We celebrate this cancellation as a win for safeguarding solidarity and for the power of the NEU trade union staff group, parents and campaigners standing together." A reminder, this is a union led by a man who has previously taken to the streets to call for the globalising of the Intifada, something he would now be arrested for in Manchester or London, something that we have seen replicated in the actions of terrorists in the northwest of this country and indeed in Australia in recent weeks. That, I think, tells you all you need to know about this union, about its attitudes to free speech, about its attitudes to debate. And it's swallowed hook, line and sinker by dim-witted educators who have forgotten what they're paid for. I wouldn't want any of those teachers educating my children. Would you? Lord John Mann is the UK government's anti-Semitism advisor, Labour peer and former MP for Bassetlaw. Thank you very much indeed for coming on the programme, Lord Mann. Your view of what this school seems to have done?
Well, it's the kind of behaviour that we expect in countries like Iran, where there are people who decide that they'll choose who goes where, who can walk on the streets, who can go into schools. And the idea in our country, with our tradition of democracy, that an elected MP is debarred from going into a school in their own constituency is a direct challenge to democracy. And those involved need to be held properly to account. So I've arranged to meet the Chief Inspector of Ofsted to see what advice there is on what should be done about this. But this is wholly unacceptable and unsustainable in a free country. These people do not have the right to dictate to others. This is not Iran. This is not Russia. This is the United Kingdom.
You might expect to see some protests about various speakers, whether they're Israeli or not, by students. I mean, we see that at university campuses. That this has come from teachers, I find astonishing.
Well, I mean, if some teacher wants to go march along the streets and join a demonstration, that's part of our freedom. But taking their politics and the extremity of their politics into schools and debarring free speech, stopping free speech, stopping and using their position and influence, which is clearly too great here, to stop an elected member of Parliament going into a school in their own constituency. Well, who are the governors of these schools and why haven't they resigned? Who's the head teacher? And what is the academy trust that this school's part of? Because they've got legal obligations, and their obligation is to uphold the law and uphold democracy, not to subvert it with them choosing who can be listened to and who can't. If they want to go live in Iran or Russia, they can do so. But it's not permissible to stop people going about their business in this way, and not least democratically elected MPs in our country.
Lord John Mann is the UK government's anti-Semitism advisor, Labour peer and former MP for Bassetlaw. Thank you for your time. 5:09. Hamza Yusuf is a British-Palestinian journalist and writer. Thank you for coming on the programme. I wonder what you make of this school's decision and the celebration of the decision by the teaching union.
I don't see anything wrong with it. I think you mentioned earlier about views and affiliated views, and why you mentioned a globalised intifada, for example, as a chant. I would argue support via affiliation for Israel is just as questionable, and I think it's well within their right to not want somebody who holds those views speaking to pupils. I don't think it's worth the media coverage. I think it's quite reckless in the framing. It's nothing to do with his Jewishness. It's more to do with the views that he holds. And he's a Labour Friend of Israel vice chair, Labour Friends of Israel, the group with links to Israel, the group that opposed the ceasefire, the group that pays for MPs to travel to Israel whilst the genocide is taking place. You don't want to use the word genocide, fine, ethnic cleansing, mass slaughter, child maiming, whatever you want to use, it fits. And why would you want somebody who's affiliated to a group whose track record as an MP hasn't been to hold Israel to account? Why would you want somebody like that speaking to students?
Well, he wasn't there to speak, as I understand it, he wasn't there to speak about events in the Middle East at all. He was there to talk about, funnily enough, democracy, which seems odd given what's happened to him since. Of course, Labour Friends of Israel, the term Israel is the country, is the state. Israel is bigger than Netanyahu. It's bigger than the decisions of Netanyahu. Would you want anybody who would call themselves a friend of Israel barred from speaking at a school?
I would argue, yeah, because if I flip it, so hypothetically, if there was somebody who, let's say an MP, hypothetically, who supported the events of October the 7th or Hamas, and they were coming to speak about sports, I suspect there'd be an uproar.
Yeah, there would, absolutely, because there is a massive difference between the state of Israel.
The state of Israel is on trial for genocide.
No, sorry, Hamza, sorry.
The
state of Israel is not on trial for genocide.
It's the army of the state of Israel.
Netanyahu is wanted for war crimes. He is not the state of Israel. The people you have described someone being a support of are a prescribed terrorist organisation. The state of Israel is not a prescribed terrorist organisation. It is bigger than Netanyahu. It is bigger than his decisions. You can be a friend of Israel, can you not? And absolutely abhor what Netanyahu has been doing.
That's fine, but like I said, we can take a look at his voting record. March 2024, MPs called to suspend.
So you can be a friend of Israel and be invited into a school, in your view?
I think being a friend of Israel after the last 2 years, I think is questionable. I think why would you want to be a friend of a state that, by the way, if you want to talk, okay, Netanyahu is the leader of that state, he's the figurehead. Israel's been committing crimes and war crimes and crimes against humanity for decades. Why would you want to be the friend of that? Just like it would be questionable and frowned upon to be a friend of Russia, to be a friend of countries that commit crimes, that commit war crimes, that have a bloody history. And that's my point.
Unfortunately, our country has a bloody history.
Well, yeah, that's reasonable. I'm not disputing that.
So a friend of Britain would not be allowed to speak in a school because of this country's, at times, absolutely awful history when it comes to violence against various communities, particularly in Africa.
Well, if we're talking specifically in this moment, for example, especially after last year, and it was referenced by the group as well, that the Bristol PSC, they referenced his affiliations and they referenced his voting record. You mentioned earlier that this head of the NEU or the figure inside the NEU, but you said he's mentioned globalised intifada. So how does that impact his wider role? Like, is that not the same?
Well, I think that's indicative of his view, isn't it? I mean, if you go onto the streets of this country and call to globalise the intifada, which includes violence, I think that shows you what you think about the kind of terrorists who marauded across the border into Israel and killed and maimed innocent people.
And I would argue, if you're a vice chair of the Labour Friends of Israel, that speaks volumes about your views, your ethical backbone, your moral
clarity. How do you know? Because there are plenty of Israelis who absolutely abhor what Netanyahu's doing. There are not plenty of supporters of Hamas that abhor what Hamas did.
Netanyahu wasn't there when Israel was being bombed in 2009, 2014. Israel bombed Gaza in 2021. Netanyahu wasn't a prime minister. Netanyahu probably wasn't alive. No, he actually probably wasn't alive in 1948 when the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians took place and the birth of Israel. The crimes of Israel predate Netanyahu.
So if anybody believes that the state of Israel has a right to exist for Jewish people who have an ancestral right to live in those lands from which they were purged thousands of years ago, would they be allowed to speak in a school?
It can exist. It doesn't have to exist as an apartheid state, as a state that commits ethnic cleansing, as a state that is on trial for genocide. Its army is on trial for genocide. And that's my point. In other words, if you are still a support... If he'd, for example, been, hypothetically, he'd a supporter... I know he was elected in 2024, but let's say, he came out and said, well, actually, I'm no longer affiliated to Labour Friends of Israel. I can't defend the state of Israel and its actions at the moment. That would be reasonable, would it not?
Well, why is it unreasonable to even hear from somebody? Not that he was talking about it at the school, but in theory, why would it be unreasonable to hear from somebody who did defend the actions of the Israeli government in Gaza wholesale?
For the same reason, you could argue, and you've put your case forward of why you wouldn't want to hear from someone who says globalised intifada. If you have a problem with that, I have a problem with the Israeli military killing countless children, making Gaza...
I have to put up with it because the head of a teaching union in this country has said it, and nothing seems to have happened.
And nothing seems to have happened about the countless genocidal statements made by Israeli officials. Instead, they were championed, supported...
But we're not responsible for that, Hamza. We're in Britain. That's up to them.
Exactly. We're not responsible, but why do you want to be a friend of that? That's my point. Why do you want to be...
But again, we're talking about two different Israels here. Your Israel is entirely constituted around the decisions of Netanyahu. Israel itself is a hell of a lot bigger than that, broader than that, far more diverse than that. But that's not an Israel you see.
I don't see that. I see an Israel bigger than Netanyahu, yeah, but I see an Israel that has for decades killed, maimed and ethnically cleansed Palestinians. That is what Israel has stood for decades now. So if somebody wants to be a friend of that in any capacity, I do find that.
And friends of Palestinians who, of course, some Palestinians have maimed, killed, purged Jewish people from those lands.
Of course, that's my point. In other words, if a state has committed a litany of war crimes, crimes against humanity, extermination, home demolitions, ethnic cleansing, whichever term you want to use, Israel has committed it. And there are figures in this, MPs in this country, lining up to be friends of Israel, friends of this state, a lobby group affiliated to it. Then that to me is questionable. And as I said, that I am pretty sure there would be an outrage and an uproar if this was just if this was to do with Russia, if this was to do with another state. Like I said, it's just about consistency. I don't see.
We have to be consistent with Britain, whether with the state as constituted of Palestine, because there are people in the Palestinian state who have committed horrific atrocities.
We have, and they get condemned, and everybody has their say on it.
If I said, we're not going to have you on today because you would say that you might be a friend of the state of Palestine, that would be appalling.
True, but sadly, because of Israel's policies, I don't have a state of Palestine, so it's negligible.
Well, Britain's recognised one. I appreciate your time. Hamza Yusuf is a British-Palestinian journalist and writer.